And Sonya, you should be able to share the screen. There we go. Awesome.
Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. As we were introduced, I'm Sean Morton, and this is Sonya Richmond. Until recently, Sonya worked as a GIS analyst and a researcher mapping bird populations and worked on breeding bird atlases for Bird Studies Canada, and I worked as a landscape photographer. 4 years ago, we sold our house, quit our jobs, and donated most of our possessions to pay for and begin a 28,000 kilometer hike across Canada on the Trans-Canada Trail. Today, we'll be exploring in a little more detail what we're doing, sharing some of our reasons for undertaking this journey and elaborating our goal of diversifying participation in the outdoors, as well as connecting people to nature through birding.
Sean, there you go. Yeah, great.
We'll then share some stories and photos from the trail and explain how we're encouraging people to connect to nature during the past 4 years on our hike, and the importance of getting a diverse youth involved as community leaders.
So are you guys seeing the slides progressing?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So as Sean said, we are just in the middle of hiking across Canada, which is not something that most normal people regularly do. Now, it might sound very impressive, walking carefree each day, trekking from sea to sea, and sleeping under the stars. But let's be honest, when you see us, or you see pictures of us, you probably don't think of us as outdoors people, explorers, or adventurers. But that's the thing we're trying to show people. To be an explorer, you don't need to be a professional athlete. You don't need specialized skills or expensive equipment, and you don't need to be super rich. All you really need is simple curiosity. And from our own backyards to the Boreal, Canada's nature is just waiting to be explored. And the Trans-Canada Trail is the perfect place to begin doing that.
Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Trans-Canada Trail, which is also known as the Great Trail in some places, don't worry, you're absolutely not alone. Though if you're in Victoria, you have an amazing part of it. First off, it's the longest recreational pathway in the world, and it's presently 28,000 kilometers long and goes to 15,000 Canadian communities. It stretches all the way from Cape Spear, Newfoundland on the Atlantic Ocean, to Victoria, British Columbia on the Pacific, to Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories on the shores of the Arctic Circle. And though most people don't realize it, the Trans-Canada Trail is within 30 minutes of 80% of Canadians. And this means if you've ever walked on a local trail in your community, especially in Victoria, it's very likely that you've already trekked along part of the Trans-Canada Trail system. When we've completed our journey, we'll have effectively walked from coast to coast to coast, visiting all 3 of Canada's oceans. Now, as Sonya said, most people aren't crazy enough to walk the entire length of a 28,000 kilometer long trail, and our parents wish we weren't as well. In fact, fewer people have completed the entire trail on foot than have gone to the moon. Sonya, in fact, is only the 5th person to have walked from the Atlantic to the Pacific. According to Canadian Geographic, it's so large that if you started walking right now, it would take you between 3 to 4 years to finish. And that's if you were hiking at a brisk pace every day through every type of weather condition and during every season. To put it in perspective, when stretched out end to end, the Trans-Canada Trail reaches 2/3 of the way around the globe. And this is what Sonya decided to bird one afternoon.
So when people hear these huge distances, their main question often is, why on earth did you choose to undertake such a journey? Well, our main reason was that we felt like the digital world was taking over our lives and those of our family members. We were spending our days working in front of computer screens, our nights watching Netflix, and in between, we were constantly checking Facebook, Instagram, or email. At the same time, a younger family member was skipping more than 40 days of high school each semester. He was stealing and lying, and eventually he lost most of his friends, all just to play video games. And in a way, it's no wonder. Studies have shown that the effects of video gaming and social media on the brain are stronger and more addictive than those of drugs like heroin. So even though we were almost constantly connected to Wi-Fi, we were becoming increasingly disconnected from each other, the natural world, and everything that was actually important in our own lives. We realized it was time to begin recharging ourselves and not just our devices. And we wanted to do something that was a little bit different. So what did we do? We wanted to get outside and get active, but we weren't particularly athletic people, and we didn't have a lot of extra money. So we focused on the one thing that's free. We figured we could walk. So between 2014 and 2018, step by step, we hiked across Ontario on the Bruce Trail. Then we set out across Spain on the Camino Frances, We trekked across France on the Via Pondensis, and soon after that, we hiked the length of Portugal on the Camino Portuguese. Now, these were all inspiring and life-changing adventures, and pretty much the moment each one ended, we eagerly began planning for the next one.
Now, while spending our vacation time hiking was fantastic, like a lot of Canadians, we were still spending most of our year in front of screens and dreaming of our next big adventure. But as we can all attest, after the last few years, digital landscapes are no replacement for real ones. So that was when we realized that getting outside, connecting with nature, and having adventures aren't things that have to happen only once a year. They didn't have to occur in far-off countries and require extensive planning or to cost a fortune. So instead of trying to cram our entire bucket list of adventures into a few precious vacation days each year, we want to find a way to connect to nature on a more regular basis.
Now, nature means different things to different people. I think it's fair to say that when most people think of nature, they tend to imagine tracts of pristine, untouched wilderness. Or we might think of a national or provincial park or a conservation area. What many of us tend to overlook is that nature can be found everywhere, even in Canada's largest cities. It can be found in green spaces and river corridors, in the trees outside our windows, in the plants that come up between the cracks in the pavement, in the birds at our feeders, and in our own backyards. There are opportunities to explore and discover everywhere. All we have to do is step outside our doors. So that seemingly simple realization is important because if we let ourselves think of nature, adventure, and exploration as things that exist only in pristine wilderness or in some far-off exotic location, the result is that we spend the majority of our time in front of screens planning or fantasizing about our next big trip, which we may or may not ever have a chance to actually take. So that simple idea is ultimately what led us to walk across the second biggest country in the world in the name of conservation, and with the goal of inspiring people of all ages, cultural backgrounds, abilities, genders, orientations, and identities to get outside and connect to nature on a more regular basis through birding.
So while many of you joined us on our final footsteps this year, I imagine that some of you are wondering what our hike was like through the last 4 years. Well, we started on June 1st, 2019, and in 556 days, we trekked more than 14,000 kilometers from Cape Spear, Newfoundland, across 10 provinces to Victoria, British Columbia. En route, we saw and experienced amazing things. We were the first to see the sunrise in North America. We scaled cliffs on rope ladders. We walked on coastal footpaths, saw icebergs and puffins, spent evenings on the sides of crystal clear lakes, and went days in remote wilderness without meeting anyone else. We've seen whales and seals in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, watched herds of caribou, encountered moose and deer on the trail, listened to coyotes call throughout the evenings, had black bear encounters in almost every province, and of course seen hundreds of species of birds. Yet best of all along the way, we've experienced overwhelming generosity, random acts of kindness, and countless words of encouragement from people and communities everywhere. Each day, depending on the weather, terrain, and water availability, we hike an average between 25 and 35 kilometers. This has varied from 5 kilometers on our first day on the East Coast Trail in Newfoundland, when we ended up scaling a cliff face and a rope in the midst of an unexpected snowstorm, to as much as 55 and 60 kilometers a day along the highways of Ontario and the vast landscapes of the prairies, when there was simply no place for us to stop for the night. Now, usually while hiking, we carry everything we need in our backpacks, which means we have our tent, sleeping bags, air mattresses, camp stove, water filter, food, and of course, our birding and photography gear. And as you can probably imagine, our packs are pretty heavy, and they often weigh between 40 and 60 pounds each, depending on the amount of food we carry between resupply points. Each day usually involved us getting up around 6 o'clock, having breakfast, packing out by about 7, and hiking till 5:30 or in the summers until nightfall. In the evening, we would set up camp, wash if possible, make dinner, and filter water. Then later on, about the time we simply want to stop moving and lay down, our workday actually began. This means throughout the night, we would plan the next day's adventure, as well as write our journals, draft and post a daily blog, edit photographs, update our social media, answer emails. Often we prepared and gave presentations from our tent, and this typically took us until about 1 a.m. every night. And this is what the first 14,000 kilometers on the Trans-Canada Trail generally looked like.
So of course, it was not all hard work and no fun. It has been well worth it. So as you know, our cross-country adventure began in Newfoundland, where we were screeched in, kissed a cod, attended a lobster boil-up on the beach, and met some of the friendliest people in Canada. Now, the Trans-Canada Trail in Newfoundland offers two very different experiences along two very different routes. So the East Coast Trail is a series of 25 footpaths for hikers that traces the rugged coast of the Avalon Peninsula, whereas the Trailway Trail follows the bed of the former provincial railway through the wild, remote, and sparsely populated center of the province. So we began on the East Coast Trail, which in places was extremely steep and rugged, involving rope-assisted climbs and descents, while in other stretches it followed boardwalks, pebble beaches, and forested pathways. Along the way, we saw humpbacked and minke whales, seals, bald eagles, and crystal blue icebergs off the coast. We marveled at towering cliffs and headlands, saw sea stacks emerging out of the mist like something from Lord of the Rings, and watched as water was shot 40 meters into the air by a natural wave-driven geyser. We walked across a 50-meter suspension bridge and admired the Berry Head Arch. In addition, we visited the famous Cape Spear Lighthouse, which is at the very easternmost point in North America, and the colony of Avalon, which was one of the founding European settlements in Canada. Perhaps most impressive of all was seeing North America's largest colony of Atlantic puffins in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve near Bay Bulls. So in addition to puffins and eagles, along the ECT, we had a chance to see many other seabird species as well, including northern gannets, razorbills, black guillemots, and common mirrors. Amid all of this, we were treated like family by strangers, invited to boil-ups, and enjoyed impromptu kitchen parties along the way.
Now, after the coastlines of Avalon, we followed the Trailway Trail, which crosses the province from east to west, and it's a gravel track that's primarily used by a thriving community of extraordinarily friendly ATVers and snowmobilers. This trail took us through the remote and spectacular scenery of the Boreal forest, far from towns and cities, which is something we had both longed to see. The Boreal, as I'm sure many of you are aware, covers 60% of Canada's area, and it stretches right across the northern part of the nation from Newfoundland to BC. It's an incredibly important ecosystem because many of North America's largest rivers begin there, and it provides us with clean air and clean water. It's also known as North America's bird nursery because more than 300 species of birds live in the Boreal, and because between 3 and 5 billion birds are born there every year. In fact, many of the birds people see in their own backyards throughout North America rely on the Boreal region. Now on the Trailway, many of our days began with the sounds of loons on pristine lakes and the sight of the sun rising over bogs filled with wildflowers. We were also privileged to watch a herd of caribou cross the plateau near us one day, be regularly visited by moose, discover these two large black bears outside of our tent one morning, and share the trail with a rare pine marten one afternoon. In terms of birds, we enjoyed spring migration, and so saw species such as the Boreal chickadee, Canada jay, ruby-crowned kinglet, pine grosbeak, flycatchers, and of course, countless migratory warblers. And as we crossed Newfoundland, most of our adventure was in the wilderness, but when we reached Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, that changed.
So when we left Newfoundland and hiked into Nova Scotia, we left the Boreal behind, and the trail took us south through Cape Breton Island into the famous Cape Breton Highlands National Park, to the home of Alexander Graham Bell, and along the Celtic shoreline. Along the way, we found active fishing harbors, beautiful beaches, wonderful views out over the Atlantic Ocean, museums, and of course, plenty of wildlife. En route, the trail provided panoramic views down the coast and took us through scenic forests. One of the highlights for us was a long stretch of pathway known as the Celtic Shores Trail, which runs along the coast of Cape Breton Island, winding through fishing communities, down pristine beaches, and through towns that are filled with wonderful art and Celtic music. We also marveled at the huge number of bald eagles in the Brass Door Lake region and watched great blue herons, semi-palmated plovers, least sandpipers, ruddy turnstones, willets, and other shorebirds along the shore. In addition to all of this, we enjoyed the Celtic music of the Rankin family and savored fresh lobster while watching the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean.
Now, beyond the culture of Cape Breton, the natural wonders of Nova Scotia were a highlight as well. Among our favorites was visiting the Bay of Fundy and getting to see a tidal bore. The Bay of Fundy is home to 16-meter high tides, which are some of the highest in the world. When the tide comes in, it starts to fill all the rivers that naturally flow out into the bay. And a tidal bore looks like a wall of water traveling up these rivers. And it occurs at the moment when rivers change direction and begin flowing in the opposite way. In addition to the tides, the vast mud flats that are exposed at low tide are one of the most important stopover points for migrating shorebirds in North America. We visited during the fall, so we had a chance to see lots of different species of birds, including the greater yellowlegs, black-bellied plovers, and spotted sandpipers. This is, of course, only a sampling of the amazing experiences in nature in Nova Scotia. The pathways also took us through forests and green spaces to ancient harbor towns, and let us learn about Mi'kmaq history and gave us a chance to explore historical forts.
So next on our journey, we ventured across Prince Edward Island, and we would have to say that out of the 3,000 kilometers of the Trans-Canada Trail in the Maritimes provinces, in our opinion, the crown jewel is PEI's 435 kilometers of path, which is known as the Confederation Trail. So while PEI might be the nation's smallest province, it boasts one of the nicest trail systems that we had encountered up to that point, although the route through Quebec does provide some pretty stiff competition, as you will see a little bit later on. So the Confederation Trail runs from one tip of the island to the other, forming a complete network of pathways across the province. So the entire trail is kept in immaculate condition, and it's composed of extraordinarily well cared for pathways under corridors of shade trees. It features information plaques along the route, distance signage, and shelters for resting, picnicking, or camping along the way. And all of those things we could have only dreamed of up to this point on the Trans-Canada Trail. So the nature of the Confederation Trail, with its beautiful rolling hill scenery, quaint villages, and broad bay seascapes, makes it the perfect means for island-wide exploration. You really couldn't ask for more. So in Prince Edward Island, we toured the province from the ferry to the Confederation Bridge, relishing the hospitality of Charlottetown, resting on the red sand of its endless beaches, and enjoying the natural beauty of the island while taking in as much of Green Gables as we could. En route across the province, we also saw a ridiculous number of great blue herons, as well as a variety of forest birds, such as common yellowthroats and northern flickers, shorebirds, and of course, waterfowl as well. So in terms of exploring and experiencing nature, PEI is truly a wonderful place to visit.
We next walked into New Brunswick, which we arrived into after crossing the long Confederation Bridge from PEI. In New Brunswick, we explored Acadian heritage, relaxed in peaceful forests, ventured through marshlands while birdwatching, and enjoyed amazing urban trails. Here we returned to the Bay of Fundy and followed the trail through the pristine coastal wilderness and hiked along the tough Fundy footpath. Afterward, we followed roads through rolling forested hills and spent days hiking along the beautiful St. John River, heading north. New Brunswick offers some fantastic urban pathways through its larger cities like St. John, Moncton, and Fredericton. In the university town of Sackville, the Trans-Canada Trail became a fully accessible boardwalk that took us through a 55-acre waterfowl marsh. Here, over 160 species of birds, including double-crested cormorants, American widgeon, northern pintail, hooded mergansers, and white-throated sparrows, as well as 200 species of plants have been sighted in the marsh. And even though it was pouring rain when we walked through here, the trail was full of people out enjoying this beautiful natural space within the city limits. The Riverside Trail in Fredericton was another example of a wonderful urban pathway in New Brunswick. The paved walkway took us along the banks of the St. John River, past beautiful historic estates into some of the city's main attractions, all while keeping us underneath a majestic canopy of old hardwood trees. And the urban trails of New Brunswick serve as a clear proof that nature could be enjoyed and explored in our backyards and green spaces across Canada.
So when we completed hiking across New Brunswick in November of 2019, it meant that we'd finished trekking across all of Canada's Maritimes region. So with a few weeks of good weather left, we hiked into Quebec on the Petit Temi to the shores of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the community of Rivière-du-Loup. Now we arrived there in the middle of a huge snowstorm with freezing cold temperatures. And since we had no winter gear with us, we pretty quickly decided to end our first year on the trail at that point. Now, as we all know, COVID emerged in 2020 and provinces began limiting travel. So because of this, when we tried to return to the trail in Quebec in May, we found that the border was closed. So as a result, Quebec stands as the only province that we've hiked piece by piece and in every season over the course of the past 4 years, rather than consecutively from east to west. Now, despite the logistical challenges involved in completing La Belle Provence, our time there was absolutely amazing. The pathways of Quebec are perhaps the most highly developed and refined in the nation, and they took us from the rugged footpaths in the Charlevoix region over the incomparable Sentier des Caps and eventually connected to the extensive multi-use cycling pathways and rail trails of the route Verte. Along the way, the Trans-Canada Trail in Quebec took us along pilgrimage routes to historic sites and through stunning landscapes as we moved across the province. Now, one of the most exciting things for us about trekking across Quebec was having the opportunity to visit many IBAs, or important bird areas. So I imagine most of you are very familiar with IBAs, but for anyone who's not too familiar with the concept, an important bird area is pretty much exactly what the name suggests. It's an area that's important to birds. So this can be because it supports a high diversity of different species, or because it provides habitat for a rare or endangered species, or because it's used as a stopover site for migrating birds that need to rest and refuel. So there are around 10,000 IBAs around the world, 600 of which are here in Canada. Now, Quebec is home to 102 IBAs, and many of them are located along the shorelines and islands of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So luckily for us, the Trans-Canada Trail took us within about 20 kilometers of 26 of these IBAs in Quebec. So because it was fall when we were walking along the St. Lawrence Seaway, many of these IBAs were filled with thousands of snow geese, as well as large flocks of gulls, ducks, and double-crested cormorants. And actually, while camping on the Sentier des Caps, we could hear the sounds of these geese down below us every night on the riverway. And it sounded like this giant cocktail party going on down there, which was a really cool kind of thing to hear. So as a side note, there are 86 IBAs located in British Columbia, over 20 of which are on Vancouver Island itself. So I'm sure most of you have visited an IBA in your travels or your work, but if not, I would highly recommend checking them out because they are great places to go birding.
Now, upon reaching Ottawa, the nation's capital, it also meant that we were again in a new province, Ontario. And this is one of the hardest and most challenging to summarize. With 6,000 kilometers of trails in the province, it took us almost 4 months of hiking to cover our route. In Ontario, the Trans-Canada Trail stretches from Ottawa in the east to Windsor in the south to Thunder Bay in the north. Ontario's trails run through the nation's capital, huge city centers that take weeks to cross on foot, across vast rural landscapes, through quiet Indigenous communities, and to beautiful provincial parks, as well as rugged national parks. Along the way, we visited amazing historic sites, explored regions of environmental significance, and ventured across the northern shorelines of Lake Superior. And despite the logistical challenges involved in crossing Ontario and its sprawling cities, we had a wonderful time and got to see tons of natures and tons of species. Here we encountered a huge assortment of wildlife on the trail, including porcupine, beavers, deer, moose, and of course, black bear once again. In addition to which, we saw over 100 species of birds in Ontario alone, including eastern bluebirds, Baltimore orioles, scarlet tanagers, indigo buntings, and northern hawk owls, just to name a few, reaffirming our belief that wildlife and birds can be found anywhere in Canada, whether in a provincial park, in an urban green space, or in your own backyard at home.
So near the conclusion of our second year on the TCT, and with the fall colors around us, we crossed the border into Manitoba. Here we began by hiking through the beautiful Whiteshell Provincial Park, heading more north than west as we went. Now this huge park looked a lot like Northern Ontario, with its vast coniferous forests, marshes, and exposed Canadian shield. After eastern Manitoba, the trail followed the Winnipeg and Red Rivers through Indigenous reserves and Mennonite communities, passing many hydroelectric dams along the waterways. As the trail wove its way slowly westward, we approached Winnipeg. The landscape changed from the sprawling boreal forest and Canadian shield to the vast, wide open prairies and agricultural lands with their endless skies. From the provincial capital, the TCT then ventured southward along the Crow Wing Trail, which is a pilgrimage route that took us south to the Canadian-US border, where the trail again shifted course, taking us northward along gravel roadways and unmaintained rail trails, which eventually led us to our next province. Now, as we hiked across Manitoba and into the prairies, we had a chance to see quite a bit of wildlife, including beavers, river otters, red squirrels, wood frogs, and white-tailed deer. And almost every single night that we camped out there, we heard packs of coyotes singing and calling as they hunted around our tent. So even in this vast and seemingly empty agricultural landscape, there was still plenty of wildlife. It just took us a while to learn how to spot it. Now, as you might expect, one of the most exciting things about hiking out of the boreal forest and into the prairies was that we started to encounter a new group of birds that we don't typically see in Eastern Canada. So some of the most exciting birds that we managed to see included the Harris's sparrow, Lapland longspurs, black-billed magpies, and best of all, in my opinion, large groups of American white pelicans. So seeing these enormous, strange-looking birds was a truly amazing experience.
So continuing on and entering into Saskatchewan, the Trans-Canada Trail wove us along a route which was more south and north than westerly, which wasn't unexpected in our world by this point. Apart from beautiful sections of the trail in the provincial parks and city centers like Regina, Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and North Battleford, we mostly found ourselves following along long, dusty gravel roads. Heading westward, these grid roads took us past historic grain elevators, through the stunningly beautiful Capel Valley, across old battlefields, through oil fields and landscapes dominated by the huge rolling hills in the western portion of the province, and somewhat unexpectedly, across several of Saskatchewan's rivers on very small ferries. As we walked across this vast landscape, we realized very quickly it was one of extremes. We were walking through a brutal heat wave at the time and a drought, as well as at times trekking through thick smoke of forest fires 2 provinces away. Even the pathway would alternate between being dry and cracked soil and thick prairie mud on the rare occasions when we experienced any type of rain. Yet at other times of the year, this region, we were told, could also be extremely and bitterly cold, or have huge floods or relentless winds. Much of the wildlife we saw, therefore, had adapted to these tough conditions, either by becoming huge, or small and living underground. Creatures like the Franklin and Richardson squirrels or white-tailed jackrabbits, or had become huge and strong on the other side, like bison, black bears, and wapiti, were frequently spotted in the wide open landscape as we hiked. In addition to which, we also continue to see new species of birds, including the American avocet, Virginia rails, and large groups of Franklin's gulls. However, given that we were there in the fall of our 3rd year, one of the most impressive things by far was seeing and hearing huge flocks of hundreds of thousands of snow geese, ducks, and cranes flying overhead. Some mornings as we watched the sun rise, we'd see continuous streams of birds stretching from one horizon to the other as they made their way south for the winter. And not only was this a spectacular sight, but it reminded us of how much birds connect us. After all, we'd seen similarly long lines of snow geese flying over the Laurentian Mountains and stopping to rest in the St. Lawrence Seaway as we crossed Quebec. We saw them again in the prairies, and we've seen them countless times flying over British Columbia during migration season on the Sunshine Coast.
So entering into Alberta, which was our 9th province, we were able to return to trekking along amazing rail trails, such as the quad-friendly Iron Horse Trail, historic routes such as the Victoria Trail, and urban pathways like those of Fort Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and Calgary, before turning west towards Banff and the Rocky Mountains. So Alberta was particularly exciting to explore because it seemed to offer a little bit of everything, including a huge range of accessible historic sites, epic landscapes, and wildly different ecozones, including the prairie grasslands, the boreal, the aspen parklands, the foothills, and the Rocky Mountains. So of course, the diversity of ecoregions and the transition zones that occurred between them support a huge diversity of birds and wildlife, which are especially suited for the different landscapes. In addition, compared to the parts of the prairies that we trekked across farther east, much of the prairies in Alberta was ranch land instead of the more intensively managed row or cereal crops, which also helped support a greater diversity of wildlife. So we enjoyed seeing everything from herds of huge, majestic elk to mule deer that were often right in the middle of towns, to red and golden mantled ground squirrels in the mountains, to colorful insects like this hummingbird clearwing. And of course, the diverse landscape of Alberta also supported a wide variety of different bird species as well, from grassland birds to waterfowl to warblers of the boreal forest to a suite of new species that we hadn't seen east of the Rocky Mountains. So a few of our favorites were varied thrushes, mountain chickadees, American three-toed woodpeckers, and Clark's nuthatches, or Clark's nutcrackers. And those were just a few of the new species that we were excited to see as we were moving westward.
And finally, we've come to our last province, British Columbia, which we entered by trekking over the Elk Pass and through the Elk Valley. Moving westward, we crossed the Selkirk Mountains, walked through the Rocky Mountain Trench, hiked the long Kettle Valley Rail Trail, all before venturing across Greater Vancouver and Vancouver Island. In the process, the National Trail led us to explore hot springs, hoodoos, and glacial lakes. It took us through long train tunnels, across vast rail trails, and led us to welcoming historic frontier towns. In BC, we also had to increasingly deal with the impact of natural disasters, including landslides, floods, and forest fires that in some areas had destroyed communities, as well as huge sections of the Great Trail. Beyond these challenges, however, we were constantly amazed by the province's natural splendors, beautiful landscapes, and its huge variety of wildlife and birds. En route, we were fortunate to see an amazing diversity of wildlife, including bighorn sheep, mountain goats, and black bears, as well as everything from butterflies to bats, several species of snakes, including the western terrestrial garter snake, northern American racer, northern rubber boa, and a gopher snake, in addition to a stunning number of different orb weavers and several black widow spiders. Beyond all this, we've seen a huge number of birds as well, especially on BC's birding trails along the Pacific Flyway, and then a number of important bird areas that we had the opportunity to explore. And finally, in November of 2022, we walked along with members of your group, Victoria Natural History Society, to Clover Point in Victoria, BC, to officially complete the Atlantic to Pacific portion of our journey on the Great Trail. Now, when we conclude the main part of our hike across Canada, we often got asked what insights we had gained along the way. And this is a difficult question to answer. But one of the things that's become evident is that if you want something to work, whether it's a farm, a business, the development of a local trail, or the conservation of a local green space, it's essential that local residents are engaged with and help lead initiatives. From what we've seen, the greatest challenge to any endeavor arises when people are not consulted, they're not part of the decision process, and aren't involved with leading projects in their own communities. This is why it's absolutely necessary to get youth involved in communities again, and with groups like the Lions, the Shriners, 4-H clubs, and nature groups, all of whom are facing declining numbers or increasing age difficulties. This is a challenge, as a disengaged youth will invariably impact upon the success of local initiatives and regional representation in the future, while an engaged youth will propel regional development and conservation initiatives for decades to come.
Okay, so there is no way to really summarize 556 days of hiking across our beautiful country, but hopefully our whirlwind tour has given you an idea of some of the different experiences Canada's Trans-Canada Trail has to offer. We've shown you photos of incredible wilderness and wildlife, and we've shared some of our favorite urban pathways. The reality is that by connecting 15,000 communities across Canada and by visiting all of the provincial capitals, quite a bit of the trail is in or very close to urban areas. So in other words, much of the Trans-Canada Trail is outside the door of most Canadians. And because of this, it is free, easily accessible, and open to everyone to explore in their own way.
So as Canadians, we have these incredible opportunities to connect with nature, literally in our own backyards, in our own communities and parks. We're told all the time that being outside increases our self-esteem and self-awareness, that it reduces the effects of stress and anxiety. It improves our concentration and fosters creativity and innovation. And over the past few years, during COVID and lockdowns, a growing number of people have come to experience the benefits of nature firsthand. So now we have this opportunity to transform people's interest in nature into action. Unfortunately, despite the evident benefits, people are often hesitant to head outdoors. And the question often arises, why is this? Well, many people have the sense that time in nature is non-productive and therefore a waste. There is unfortunately a pervading social fear that being outside is dangerous and it should be avoided. This is something we encountered a great deal in our hike. It also has to do with the sense that connecting with nature is only possible or worthwhile if you're fully immersed in a pristine wilderness, where that real outdoor adventure requires us to travel to far off and exotic locations. Often we meet people that believe that unless you're in Banff or Jasper, you're not really in nature, which is unfortunate. And unfortunately, there's also a perception that outdoor activities are something only to be enjoyed by a select few in special locations and at certain times. We've been taught to think that nature is supposed to look a certain way, and that to be outdoors, we have to look a certain way or be a certain type of person, but this simply isn't true. Nature is not in one special place. It's not for one special person. Nature is wherever someone is trying to find it, and it is undoubtedly for everyone. The pursuit of nature and time outdoors is enough to make you a birder, an explorer, and an outdoors person. And this is the point that we've been trying to emphasize and reiterate in every community that we've hiked through in the past 4 years.
Now we're trying to use our hike to break down some of the barriers to getting outside every day that Sean just mentioned. But of course, under normal conditions, those aren't even the biggest issues that come into play for most of us on a daily basis, including our children and grandchildren. The biggest issue is, of course, screen time. Most kids now spend more time on their devices than in nature. Many would rather play video games than play outside after school, and most adults would rather watch a movie or scroll through Facebook and Instagram rather than going outside for a walk after a long day. And this is largely because such activities take us offline and away from our screens. So the key isn't to try to convince people to give up what they enjoy doing, but rather to find ways to help us use technology and our mobile devices to explore the world. So we are trying to help people do just that by reconnecting to nature through birding. So when people hear this, their first question often is, well, why birds? Now, I'm sure many of you could probably answer this question, but it basically comes down to the fact that birds are a great way to connect with nature because they're free and fun to watch, and they are everywhere. No matter who you are or where you live, whether it's in an RV, an apartment building, or a condo tower, in the suburbs or somewhere way out in the country, it is impossible to go outside your door and not hear or see at least one bird. More than that, birds are a great way to connect with nature because they need our help. So according to the State of Canada's Birds Report, some groups of birds are doing very well, like waterfowl and birds of prey. And actually those two groups represent a really nice example of how widespread conservation efforts across North America have made a huge difference in helping birds rebound and thrive. Other groups like grassland birds and aerial insectivores are not doing so well, and they need our help. So where do we begin? Well, one place to begin, as we show youth and others who are new to the outdoors, is by becoming a citizen scientist. So I imagine most people that we're talking to tonight are already citizen scientists. But for anyone who isn't familiar with this concept, a citizen scientist is someone who makes observations about birds or nature and then reports them online to help scientists understand how our wildlife populations are doing. So this is great because it means that anyone can do it, whether you're 5 years old or 95, whether you're a novice or an expert birder. As long as you love going outside, finding really cool things, and learning to identify what they are, you can be a citizen scientist. And the great thing is, it can be a lot of fun to do this with the help of a few free apps for your phone. So there are, as I'm sure you're aware, several free apps that you can use to not only learn about birds, but also to submit your observations to become a citizen scientist. So for all of the birders in the group, I imagine you are already avid eBird users. But the app that we most often recommend to beginner birders and naturalists is called iNaturalist, and it is also freely available for anyone with a mobile device to download and use. Now, iNaturalist is nice because it is very simple to use. You basically just take a photo of something in the natural world and upload it to the app. You'll then be presented with a series of photos that you can compare your own with to help you identify what you just took a picture of. Once you've submitted your photo, you'll get confirmation or a correction for your ID, and your observation will become valuable data that scientists can use to monitor our wildlife populations. Now, the other really nice thing about iNaturalist is that you can submit observations of almost anything in the natural world. So not just birds, but also butterflies and other insects, bats, reptiles, mammals, trees and flowers. Whatever you're interested in, this app will work with it. In addition, the app also keeps track of your observations, so you can build a life list of all the species you've seen and where you saw them. And if you use the Seek version of the app, which is great for kids, you'll be invited to enter different challenges. So as you build up your collection of species, you can earn badges for different achievements. So for anyone with kids or grandkids who play video games, this might start to sound pretty familiar. You travel around collecting things, you complete various challenges, you can compete with your friends if you want to, and you earn achievements. So citizen science is a lot like video gaming, which is something that many people already love to do, but of course with several very important differences. It gets you outside and being active. It teaches you about birds and other wildlife. It helps you connect with the natural world, and it makes a huge contribution to conservation. So birds and citizen science are a great way to bridge the divide between our digital world and the natural one, and they are the perfect tool to make exploration and outdoor adventure part of our everyday routine.
Now, of course, citizen science isn't the only way we can help birds out. There are some simple things that we also suggest that people do. And once again, I'm sure many of you are doing them. We can buy bird-friendly packaging and bird-friendly products, such as shade-grown or bird-friendly coffee and items with less packaging. We can keep our cats indoors and our dogs on leash, especially on beaches. We can make our yards bird-friendly. We can help to prevent bird and window collisions by putting up decals on our windows. We can turn off unnecessary lights, especially during migration season. And finally, we can help by getting local youth involved and those who have an interest in nature become engaged in conservation and become active leaders in their own communities.
And the wonderful thing is, when we help birds, our actions have a positive impact beyond our own backyard, our own community, and even our own country. As you all know, many bird species are migratory, which means that every spring they fly north to breed in parts of Canada, and every fall they return to the southern US and parts of Central and South America to overwinter. So what this means is that many of the birds we see in our own backyards and work so hard to protect locally rely on other habitats as well as the ones we observe them in. In Canada, the boreal forest is a key example of an essential habitat that is particularly important for many birds. It's known as Canada's bird nursery because over 300 species breed there, and it accounts for the well-being of between 3 and 5 billion birds. So this means that any actions we take in our own backyards and communities have a profound impact on conservation efforts across the continent and help bird species from coast to coast to coast. In essence, it means that our backyards are connected to the boreal. And so if you're putting up a bird feeder or a bird bath in your area, then you're having an impact that extends well beyond your own backyard. So with all of that said, we will end our talk there. We will just close by saying that right now we have an unprecedented opportunity to reach out to new audiences across the country. And we hope that our hike and our message will help inspire people to reconnect with nature and to take advantage of this opportunity. If you'd like to follow our hike through our blog, Facebook, or Instagram, the links are on the screen right now. And we hope that you take the opportunity to follow along as we continue our hike for birds over the coming years, especially as we try to head north towards the Arctic. So if you have any questions, you can contact us online or by email, or we will do our best to answer, or you might have some questions you can ask us right now if there's time. So thank you all very much for taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Sonya and Sean. That was awesome. And I think we all probably learned a lot about Canada that we didn't know just with your talk. If people would like to unmute, you're welcome to do so to ask questions, put up your hand, or post something in the chat if you like. I'm sure that both Sean and Sonya would be happy to try and answer them now. Katie? Oh, I thought I had a question there. If you could unshare, Sonya, then we can see if anyone has their hand up. Okay, I'm not seeing any here. I'll start you with a question. Is there anything that if you were to do it again that you would do differently than you did the first time?
That's a tough question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't know. It's harder than we thought it would be. We don't quite fit in with, when people go backpacking, they take the lightest gear. And the moment you try to take binoculars and a birding scope and birding cameras, it becomes a bit more daunting. I don't think we really realized what we were getting into. The first time we went hiking was on the Prairie Trail, and it was 800 kilometers. And you can come home and blog it kind of at will and do whatever. And we were doing it every night. And so when you realize for 2 years straight, you're hiking 40 kilometers a day and working into the middle of the night, it becomes a different thing.
That is absolutely true. And I think people underestimate how long it takes even to write a paragraph for a blog, especially when you're tired. So kudos to you guys for doing that. Lots of comments in the chat talking about the inspiration and the good to see you again. Some of the people that hiked with you that last little bit. One person asked, on average, how many hours a day would you hike?
It depended.
Yeah, I guess it depends. I mean, in the prairies, we walked long days. We did up to 60 kilometers a day on the roads. And we were there in the summer, so we had a lot of daylight. I mean, it was getting light at 4:30 in the morning and it wasn't getting dark till 11 at night. So we walked quite a few hours, probably 10 or more hours, a lot of those days. But then
flatter than the mountains.
Yeah, and then, I mean, this year we walked longer than we had before, but of course, as the season goes on, we lose daylight, you know. So when we were doing Vancouver Island, we basically had light from like 8 in the morning till 4:30 or so,
right.
Something like that. So our days just got a lot shorter. So it really depends. Like some days are really short for us, 5 to 10 kilometers, and some were up to 60. So it depended. A nice day that we're happy with is generally somewhere around 35 kilometers, I think. That's like a nice amount to walk, but yeah.
I really like the fact that you broke your trip up and that it was fine. I think that sometimes when people think about doing a long hike, like, you know, they're working on a spine trail on Vancouver Island, that they think they have to do it all at once. And I like it when people prove that, no, you can do it in bits and pieces, you know, chunks that work for your schedule and your fitness level and all that sort of thing. So I think that may be a new perspective for a lot of people here as well.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the challenges we faced at the beginning was a lot of online critique. And we came to realize a lot of the people that were critiquing in the ways they were critiquing weren't people that were doing things like this. I mean,
right.
No one does this sort of thing, of course, but it would be people that if you're not through hiking it in the winter, if you're not out there in minus 60, you're not really doing it. And you're kind of left going, what does that have to do with anything? Well, of course you could break it into weekends. Of course you could do it at your own schedule. It has nothing to do with when you're doing it. It's about the experience. And so you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I think that makes it much more accessible to people that couldn't do a 2-year through hike on a trail or anything like that. So it's great to see examples like you guys doing it this way. Are there any other questions? We've still got over 60 people in the room, so they're all waiting for answers to the questions someone else is going to ask.
I see Kevin Slagboom wrote, how many pairs of hiking shoes did you go through?
So I think it's 10 pairs of shoes each and about 5 pairs of sandals each so far.
So far, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're getting a few questions in here. Did you fundraise or have a sponsor?
We have never gotten a sponsor. As we talk about some of the challenges we've had, people have a perception that unless you're the first, it's not interesting. And we were bluntly told selling science is boring. So we have never received a sponsorship. The only caveat being is when we became a Royal Canadian Geographic Society expedition 2 years ago. For the 1 year, we received the major grant, and that was $5,000, which covered our plane trip back to the trail at that point. So funding is not big in Canada, and it's a real challenge.
I can see that. David asks, what were your worst and or most terrifying moments?
The prairies. I think it's not going to be a very nice comment, I suppose, but one of the scariest moments for me on the trail was coming out of Manitoba. We just crossed the border from Manitoba into Saskatchewan, and you come in to the province in Duck Mountain Provincial Park. So it's not a mountain in the sense that BC has a mountain, but it's a bit raised up. And we came out of the park and it was kind of forested, and then we emerged onto this like open area. And because we were higher up, we could see the prairies extending out. It looked like hundreds of kilometers in front of us. Like it was fields huge grain fields just extending to the horizon in all directions. And I was like, there's no way we're not going to survive walking across that. It just goes on forever, and it's these fields. But Saskatchewan did turn out to be one of those beautiful provinces. In many ways, it was absolutely gorgeous. But that moment, I was just like, what are we doing?
I'm surprised at this Sonia's answer. I thought when we first sold the house, her parents didn't know, and she flew out west to tell them. And the house sold while she was on the plane. So I called her dad to say, you have to turn her around after she talks to you to come and sign all the contracts. And she answered the phone and she said, my God, you don't know what we've done. The plane trip just took 6 hours and it just goes on forever. You have no idea what we're about to do. And it was kind of unnerving before we'd ever stepped on the trail.
I can see that. When Tom asked, did you take most of the photos that were in your presentation?
Yes, except for the citizen science pictures at the end. Yes, they're all ours.
Great.
We took, at the moment, we've just crossed 750,000 pictures.
750,000.
It's been a lot to go through. So
yeah, it's kind of like the blogging thing. The hours that you would spend just filtering those is huge.
Yeah.
Vicky has noted that you have merchandise available. You are absolutely welcome to promote your merchandise and other funding that you're looking for.
Yeah, we do have a store. It's got t-shirts, and at the moment it's got note card sets. So there are sets of 6 note cards that are all photos of, there's landscape sets, bird sets, and animal sets. And they can be purchased on our website. So we just have an online store link. You can, I think, pay by PayPal or credit card. And it's just on our website. Come walk with us .online, and there is also a donation page on there as well.
Excellent. Okay, last chance, folks, here for any questions. Okay, so Sean Morton and Sonya Richmond, thank you so much for presenting to us tonight. That was a great talk, and we're very happy that you came and ended your cross-country part of this here in Victoria with us, and that some of the folks that were with you suggested that we get you on here to talk about the big picture, and I'm really glad that you did that. I will also add that it is cold here tonight. I have been receiving a text from someone who had a Rufous hummingbird, or not a Rufous, an Anna's hummingbird at their feeder after dark tonight, and quite desperate, it seems. So do keep in mind your feeders are likely to freeze tonight. If you can find a way to keep them unfrozen or bring them in and put them out before first light tomorrow, your hummingbirds will appreciate that. And we will see you next time. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.